people say, do you think it was true? And I said, I don't know.
It was a man-made experiment that went wrong.
What it could have been, I wouldn't know. I still don't know.
But they got nearly up to this UFO, but it was close enough that you could see some creatures, or he said they didn't look like human beings out there.
Early July 1947, a local rancher, Mac Brazel, discovered strewn across his ranch a whole bunch of debris.
They successfully managed to keep the story quiet then for a further about 30 years before people really picked up on it again.
Roswell is still a mystery to this day. It's the big bang of the modern UFO phenomena, and we still can't answer the questions. Somebody knows what happened, but the American government aren't giving anything up.
Roswell is the one story that will never die. Roswell has become a legend, if you like.
None of the materials that we picked up weighed anything. Looked like it was weightless. You couldn't feel that you had anything in your hands.
It's hard for me to believe that in this infinitesimally small area of the universe that we're the only people with any intelligence.
Even after all these years, it's one that is still hotly debated by skeptics and believers alike.
We all have questions about aliens.
Are we totally alone in the universe?
Look at that thing, dude. There's a whole fleet of them. Look on the SA.
Everybody who was there saw something. Now, what that thing was is then left to our imagination because it was hushed up very quickly.
I mean, when we talk about beings from another world or the possibility of it, we like to think it's something new, but in fact it's not.
There are certain secretive units that belong to certain governments are very preoccupied with UFOs visiting Earth.
Is not an alien force already among us?
It is a legend, and trying to get to the bottom of it is virtually impossible, but every now and again the rumour goes round, does it not, of course, that they, whoever the hell they are, or the government, which part of the government, are going to tell us everything.
The context that leads up to the Roswell incident is all important. For 6 years, the world had been at war with intense stresses and strains. The end of World War II, we had the nuclear bombs, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the impact of that on the psyche of the world, the fear that introduced on top of 6 years worth of stress and strain of death of loved ones.
Looking back to the old days of the invasion, if you remember.
War of the Worlds.
Yeah, and the effect it had on people on the East Coast particularly. And I thought that perhaps maybe this was a good reason. I have reason now to believe that it was more than just protecting the public from getting upset over something.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
The War of the Worlds was a broadcast we did based on H.G. Wells' story of the invasion of the world by the Martians.
Coming out of World War II, we went straight into the Cold War and an enormous imbalance between East and West, between Russia and the United States. Truman had demonstrated beyond doubt ferocious nuclear capability, and Stalin without nuclear weapons. So there was a complete mismatch and a concern about how best to balance that up from an Eastern perspective.
Now we have to remember this is early July, so we're talking July 2nd-ish. It's only just under 2 weeks before that we had the first flying saucer sightings by Kenneth Arnold on June the 24th, and the term flying saucer went around the world.
Reported in the press the sighting of an unidentified object skipping over the treetops, which the journalist reported as a flying saucer, the first ever reference to a flying saucer in the press. And that was just 2 weeks prior to the Roswell incident.
The story goes that in 1947, in July 1947, something crashed.
A rancher, Marcel, found some unearthly wreckage on his land.
Strewn across his ranch, a whole bunch of debris from some sort of device which appeared to have crashed down from the heavens.
And he wasn't wealthy. I mean, he didn't even have electricity. Hence, when he found this stuff one morning, he couldn't pick up the phone and ring somebody. It was about a quarter of a mile long, this strange debris. His sheep wouldn't go anywhere near it. And he thought, what the hell is this?
But the rancher didn't say much. The rancher really said, hey, I was out and I was riding and I saw this and this is what it looked like and I couldn't figure out what it was. And so I came to town to tell some people and mentioned it to some people, and pretty soon there was great interest.
He travelled to his nearest neighbour, Loretta Proctor, to show her pieces of the spaceship that had crashed on his ranch.
Mac thought it was a weather balloon or some sort of an experiment, that he was glad to do the government a favor to bring them the pieces. Mm-hmm. And that's actually the attitude he had when he gathered it up and took it to town.
Box of this stuff, took it into town, and he showed Sheriff Wilcox. And the sheriff had no idea what this material was. The main material was a piece of what's got the nickname of memory metal, a piece of aluminium type material that you screw it up in your hand, let go of it, and it just unfolded back to its natural shape again. So he said it must be something to do with the military. I'll ring the airbase. It was called Roswell Army Air Force because the Army and the Air Force were still one body. They actually went their separate ways in September 1947. The crash happened in early July 1947.
Roswell itself needs to be put in context. People often ask why Roswell. It's in the middle of New Mexico in a desert. And yet it was the very epicenter of the development of nuclear weapons in the United States.
So this wasn't some remote little place where you got stuck out in the desert. It was a very sensitive installation. It was the 509th, for example, although they didn't fly from Roswell, but it was the 509th who dropped the bombs on Japan to effectively end the Second World War. It was a nuclear facility.
The very first detonation of a nuclear device in the United States on a test base took place less than 2 hours drive away from Roswell to the west. Roswell as an air base was at the very core of the nuclear initiative.
They said that they had found a flying disc, but that was understood to mean that it was extraterrestrial in origin. This was not an earthly piece of wreckage that had landed.
And of course, the main man involved when it became the Roswell crash was Major Marcel, the base intelligence officer.
Major Jesse Marcel was in charge of the Roswell investigation. He was the air intelligence officer of what was at the time the world's only atomic bomb squadron. So if there was anybody in the world that would have been able to identify anything that should have been in the skies, it was Major Jesse Marcel.
So Marcel and Cabot get there, they collect some of this debris. Marcel on his way back, he didn't live on the base. He stopped at his home about 1 o'clock in the morning. Got his son out of bed, Marcel Jr., he was I think 11 years old at the time, and his wife, spread this material out on the kitchen floor. Look at this. And it was Marcel Jr. who picked up this piece of material, and he called it an I-beam. So it was about this long. If you looked at it edge on, it looked like a capital I, about 1 inch wide. And it had these purplish markings on it. He calls them hieroglyphics, but these markings. And his father said to him, son, you may be the first person to see writing from another world.
And then there were fragments of what appeared to be I-beams, relatively small, but the typical I-beam type configuration.
What could it be? Could it be a new kind of aircraft that they were developing that didn't look like an aircraft? It crashed on testing.
Within 24 hours, that press release was taken back, and rather than it being a flying disc that they were reporting, they were now saying that it was a crash site for a weather balloon.
It's the very next morning, some friendly person, probably from Clinton Anderson's office, called us from Washington and said, we understand that you have some information, and we want to assure you that if you release it on this matter, because it's not supposed to be released, it's very possible that your license could be in jeopardy.
Roswell Daily Record, it says General Ramey, who was the boss at the time, empties the Roswell saucer. And that was it. And what they did, they got Marcel to pose in General Ramey's office with some material that was a weather balloon.
The explanation provided by the Army Air Force that the Roswell incident was associated with a crash site for a weather balloon gained traction and effectively suppressed the interest in the Roswell incident for decades to come.
They successfully managed to keep the story quiet then for a further about 30 years. Throughout the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, people were seeing strange things in the sky and reporting them. The government had come out with a report saying that largely these UFOs were nothing unearthly and nothing to worry about.
It wasn't until it was 1978 that UFO researcher and nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman.
This is Stanton Friedman. I'm a nuclear physicist with a very strong interest in flying saucers. I'm in Kansas City, Missouri.
Was doing a TV show talking about UFOs, and one of the production staff said, why don't you talk to old Marcel? He claims to have seen one of these things, crashed. Never heard of him.
I'm here to do an interview with a very important witness with regard to the recovery of a crashed flying saucer in New Mexico in July 1947.
So he got his name in, looked in the phone book, there he is, rung him up, and that was Major Marcel, first on site with his box of goodies that he showed to his son. And it was only then that the investigation, in inverted commas, of Roswell began, as far as civilian research was concerned.
Jesse Marcel himself came out, now retired, and began to question whether or not it was credible that a weather balloon could account for what had been discovered at the Roswell site back in 1947.
And what I saw, I couldn't believe there was so much of it. It was scattered over such a vast area. So we proceeded to pick up as much of the debris as we could, loaded in a wagon. We filled that up. It took us a good part of the day to do that.
None of the materials that we picked up weighed anything. Looked like it was weightless. You couldn't feel that you had anything in your hands.
And all of a sudden, the Roswell incident rose to the fore once again.
He came out, he told the press that was there, he said that was nothing but a weather balloon, crashed weather balloon. It was definitely not a weather balloon. And it was an aircraft. So what it could have been, I wouldn't know. I still don't know.
One of the things that I still remember specifically is that the material, they said, was as thin as the wrapper on a Lucky Strike package, but you couldn't break it. And if you twisted it and scrunched it up together, it would come back to its own deal.
But the thing about that got me is that you couldn't even bend it, you couldn't dent it. Even with a sledgehammer would bounce off of it. So I knew that I had never seen anything like that before. And as of now, I don't know what it was.
It was a good mystery for a small town. But of course we had at that particular time, we had a lot of military people here, as you know.
People's interests were peaking towards the late 70s, when there were several documentaries and also fiction films, people from Roswell started speaking out about their story, which people just grabbed with total enthusiasm.
My father was the sheriff of Jacobsen County.
A large silver disc-shaped object was embedded in the side of the ridgeline.
The government's hiding information about UFOs from us? And this
It must be.
Pile of, I guess, space wreckage.
I think he was threatened with something.
Knowing his reliability, I had no doubts, but it was real. And of course, he said that he was sworn to secrecy.
We just decided that for Walt Hunt's sake and so forth, that we would sit tight and accept whatever it was, even though in our innermost minds we had real question about the validity of it.
No longer hide the truth. Bob Lazar claims our government captured alien spaceships, UFOs, and keeps them in a secret warehouse.
In the 1980s, Bob Lazar was recruited as a development scientist by the US government, working in Area 51 in a unit referred to as S4.
The contention of UFO researchers that there is a secret government within our government.
They are actively and have in their possession alien spacecraft, and they are actively undergoing analysis.
In 1989, he started to go public, working the media channels, telling stories of what he'd seen during his working life on Area 51.
When I was let in, it was the first time I saw the sport model in the hangar sitting down, and I was told they could have walked me in the front door, but they purposely wanted to walk me by it. I was told not to say anything and just keep my eyes forward and walk past the disc into the office area. After that, I got to see it actually lift off the ground and operate.
Telling stories of aliens, telling story of spacecraft, flying saucers, reportedly having touched and, if not worked with, the flying saucer that supposedly crashed at Roswell. Before you knew it, he had celebrity status.
Why keep a secret about probably one of the most important events in history, that there's been contact from an alien civilization? It's a significant event in history. More significant than anything.
For sure, the government want this information. So there's still, believe it or not, there are those underground cloak and dagger, dark departments of intelligence services that are investigating the possibility that there is that force out there, and we want to get to it first. My interpretation would not agree with someone else, or their theories I will not agree to, but I have my very own theories, and I want to believe.
People saw something that was really strange, and a lot of ordinary people who haven't got anything to gain have said that they saw alien beings, or their family members saw these alien beings.
Again, it depends on who you talk to. They say at the crash site there was 3 or 4. One was alive, the humanoid, looked pretty much like us.
In 1990 itself, a character called Glenn Dennis started to go public with his own personal, first-hand account of what happened at Roswell.
Glenn was a local mortician who used to offer his services to the airbase. And he remembers in July 1947, whether it's related or not, he got a strange phone call.
To see if he could provide the smallest hermetically sealed casket that he could possibly produce for some activity that was taking place at the Roswell Air Base.
Probably 1:30 in the afternoon, and I received a telephone call from the mortuary officer out at the Walker Air Force Base. He was inquiring about what would be the smallest possible casket that we could get that would be hermetically sealed.
That may or may not be linked, but he said he went to the base, he had clearance to go on the base, and he said there was chaos going on.
And that's the way I became really involved at the base.
And he was friendly with one of the nurses there. And he saw her and met her, and she was horrified that it was there. And they went and had a cup of coffee or whatever. And she said, I've been pulled in to look at, what was going on, and she said, get the hell out of here.
She was so upset. She looked like she was, in shock is what she really talked like and looked like.
She then went on under some discussion with Glenn to explain what she had seen associated with the incident, and did some drawings of aliens that she had witnessed on site.
They were like 3.5 feet to 4 feet tall. Heads, the hands were long, no thumbs. It was just the long, very delicate fingers. The head, the lips were just a long, narrow, more or less, not full lips like we would have in most of our people. And also that the nose, there was only 2 small orifices in the nose. There was really no nose that was convex.
It's difficult to know what to believe, because if it wasn't for the subject matter being so absurd, you certainly would believe these people. You've got no reason to disbelieve them.
She never touched a meal. That all the time we were talking in an hour and a half that we were there, she never touched her meal.
Shirley Wright was an undergrad studying under Einstein, and she claims she acted in the capacity of his assistant during her studies.
In 1993, the Shirley Wright tapes were then released. Shirley Wright apparently was an aide to Albert Einstein, and in previous years, Einstein had been invited along to Area 51 to have a look at the developments that were taking place there, to have a look in particular at the flying saucer technology to see if they could understand what the propulsion mechanisms were.
Tell me a bit more about the beings, the communication. What kind of information was given? Did they ask you anything? Did you ask them anything?
Oh yeah, it was going both ways. We asked them several questions and they asked us several questions.
She gets into quite some detail with these questions that the aliens were asked.
They knew right away that we are intellectually inferior and scientifically inferior.
Well, then how was it that they crashed? Was there any information about that? Because if they have such great technology, how is it that something had gone wrong?
Exactly, that's what we thought. And there was a lot of things like that we had asked them. We asked them what they ate. We asked them what kind of gases they use, like I had mentioned before. We asked them about their life, their support, their origin. We asked them what they use for propulsion.
So is this something that she witnessed, or could this be maybe something that she sort of picked up from cultural myths over the years?
The entourage were given free rein to get inside the spacecraft and have a look and have conversations with aliens that were actually being held on site. So an extraordinary account of a number of exchanges with these aliens who apparently were looking for an alternative series of planets that they could look to colonize over time. Extraordinary stories. Again, resonating beautifully with the Roswell incident.
They didn't let me touch it, but the other people were permitted to do that just because they were curious about, knowing what kind of materials they used.
I can't think of a reason why anybody would do this in her position. She's credible, she was a student of Einstein, she's got nothing to gain. She hasn't sought fame and fortune or even, any attention from her story. It didn't come out until after she died. So this doesn't seem to me like anything other than somebody getting something off their chest.
And this is kind of a key point, because all of a sudden the stories through the 90s started to take a focus less so on the spacecraft itself, but maybe on the aliens and these creatures that were visiting.
She claimed to have photographs. But they've never materialized. So it's another, one of those stories, and in that respect, that bit the dust.
Do we believe them? Well, why not? They're not liars. Are they liars? Who knows? Are they just enthusiastic? Are they embellishing the truth? Are they mistaken?
When we think about what an alien looks like, the classic alien grey.
These creatures, all of them were
about 4 foot tall, 4.5 feet tall. They had very large heads that were shaped larger on the top, and they kind of tapered down.
And there were 9 total that I saw, each one being different.
An alien being could be a representative of me or you or anybody else. You know, it's not black, it's not white. You know, it's every person, man, woman, any race, any gender. So I think that's important psychologically.
Why should we think in this little weensy part of the universe that we're the only people who were ever created with any intelligence?
So there's a number of people claimed that bodies, but what is interesting is that the US authorities always said, no, there was no bodies, because it was a balloon.
In 1995, we then have the release of the Alien Autopsy tapes, which actually showed aliens being analysed. Being dissected and understanding the physiology. Quite extraordinary tapes again.
Senator Schiff, the senator for New Mexico, he ordered what's called the General Accounting Office in the United States to look into Roswell and find any documentation, any paperwork that you could. A lot of the paperwork from the base, outgoing messages had disappeared. The United States Air Force published their report, Roswell, case closed, and they finally admitted that there were bodies recovered.
Further fueling, adding more fuel to the fires around the enthusiasm for the Roswell incident.
I'm probably the ultimate expert in the world. There's no one else, and I don't say that to be arrogant. It's just that I've put in the man hours, and I've done the research, I've done the work, and I can categorically say without a shadow of a doubt that I can probably tell you anything you need to know.
Everybody knows Spiros's role in the film. Nobody knows more about it than him. Yeah, he's a real expert.
The fact that something crashed in Roswell is undisputed. Everybody who was there saw something. Now, what that thing was is then left to our imagination because it was hushed up very quickly. It's said that it's not from this world, and we know there were autopsies. There were bodies recovered, and there were autopsies. So, as a military operation, of course it's secret. As a researcher, the first thing you do is you establish what's in the room. You look at those items and see when they were made and when they were phased out. Now, it doesn't mean to say, for example, if the clock on the wall, if that was phased out, say, in the 60s, of course it might be there in the 70s or the 80s. It could linger on. But the important part is, was it available at that key date of 1947? This is a General Electric Bakelite wall clock. It's powered by the mains. You plug it into the wall, and it was manufactured in 1945. So could it be there in 1947? Absolutely. So is it correct? Absolutely. Cannot be disputed. In fact, General Electric themselves confirm that it's a genuine 1945 clock. So we know that's genuine. What else can we look at in the room? So we look around and we say, okay, so there's a telephone on the wall. Can that be genuine? Well, a novice would say no. Telephones in 1947 didn't have a curly wire. But a novice would say that because an expert would know that that curly wire was available as an add-on extra. When you ordered the phone, you could have a curly wire, but it was standard issue for hospitals, schools, and military establishments. So this is why this would probably be more real than not.
This is on the phone. I have film of the UFO crash at Roswell and the aliens being dissected. That's a great story. Show me.
As a researcher, I would look at things like, well, if this is an antique clock, why is it brand new? Because it wouldn't be brand new if it was bought in, say, 1995 when the film emerged. So if it was a 1990, it would be a 50-year-old clock. It would have scratches and scrapes and dents, but it doesn't have any of that. Everything is seen to be pristine.
This particular storyline is in itself extraordinary. And so we have to pick it apart in some more detail, I think, just to understand its likelihood.
We see things like a handsaw, a stainless steel handsaw, which is correct for the time. In modern days, we use motors with motorized saws, but this is 1947 or supposed to be. And so can we verify that the autopsy kit is correct? And that's 100% correct. It's not a pathologist that's doing the autopsy at all. It's a surgeon. And this has been verified by the top pathologists around the world, including Cyril Wecht, who had done over 40,000 autopsies, and he's the top guy called in America to do all the court cases. So a man that I look at and I admire, and he specifically, categorically said this is a genuine autopsy, and it's a surgeon, not a pathologist. Why is that relevant? Well, a little bit further, you dig a little bit further, and you find the only person that had top clearance to do an autopsy if this was an alien in Roswell, in America, in 1947, was a guy called Dr. Bronk, and he was a surgeon. So this is very relevant. So you ask me, why is it genuine? I think there's pretty much a lot of conclusive evidence why this is genuine. You've got to throw belief out the window because facts are looking at you. They're staring you in the face. Some believe it's a hoax. I've spoken to many ufologists. Some believe this is a genuine film from the US military.
There was an email thread dumped online. It's 11 pages long, and it involves an organisation that was called the National Institute for Discovery Sciences, clarifying some comments that Dr. Kit Green, his real name's Christopher Green, had made about the alien autopsy film. Dr. Green used to work for the CIA at one point. And Green's saying, yeah, I was shown the exact same film back in the 1980s when I worked for the CIA. So he was challenged, was Dr. Green, and he then said, no, I was conned by the CIA, I don't think it's real anymore. But all of them, every single one of them on this email thread, for some reason, thought it was real.
People coming out of the woodwork over the years about Roswell, new elements to the story, new details.
In 1999, we then have the release of the Charles Forgus interview tapes. Charles, in previous decades, had been a deputy sheriff in one of the neighbouring counties to Roswell.
Not from New Mexico, but actually from Texas. Him and his boss, the sheriff, were en route to Roswell. They'd been looking for a guy who'd been cashing dud checks, and he'd been caught and put in jail in Roswell, and they were en route to pick him up when they heard about the crash on the police radio. And you can see him, pictures of him and his, as a policeman, and his stripes, around his helm.
When they arrived at the airbase, they stumbled across the incident and had a look at, got close to, both the spacecraft that had crash-landed in a riverbank and the aliens themselves who were lying around with sheets covering most of their body parts.
And you just happened to be at the place when
it already had crashed.
It had already crashed.
Yeah, they were there taking them out and everything, and they was soldiers there with God, I don't know how many there, but there must have been 300 or 400 of them. They wouldn't let you get any close to them, and they're keeping the people away. People come out there and check this thing, and they wouldn't let them get close to it.
Nobody knew about him. We found an interview on VHS tape quite by coincidence.
across the middle of it. You measured it across the middle, it's about 100 feet.
Did you see any kind of like lights around it?
It all went out when it banged into that wall in that creek. It hit the wall.
What kind of a wall was it at the creek? Was it just part of the ground?
Yeah.
Like a mountainside, or?
Yeah.
And then there was a creek.
Yeah. And I think it killed everyone on that thing.
And they were asked, politely, shall we say, in inverted commas, to go away, don't talk about it, you know. But you can't order them. They, you know, these are public servants. They're not members of the military.
You were about 10 feet away?
Yeah.
You were that close? You can almost reach out and touch someone.
I might have been further away than that. I don't know. I didn't have glasses then. I could see pretty good.
It's all part of the legend of Roswell.
What did you see, legs and...
Face on some of them. And maybe the leg or feet on some of them.
What did the feet look like? Do you remember?
It looked like our feet.
Really?
Yeah.
He was a straight shooter. You know, that's why he went straight into the police force after the war. And he said, do you know he's got a son? He told us in no uncertain terms that his father talked about this incident several times. And it's not what he talked about, it's when that's important. And he said, I remember my father talking to us about this in the 1950s. I can't be precise which year. He said, no, it was the 1950s because we actually moved house. So it was a big event. The reason that the date is the most important thing is because Roswell was dead. It was a flash in the pan in 1947, rose up for a couple of days and then had disappeared. So in the 1950s, there were no books about Roswell, there were no articles about it, no television stories. You couldn't find any info. It was dead, it was gone. It never made it into the public domain in any way, never made its way into popular culture at that time.
In 2011, Annie Jacobsen, an investigative journalist based in the United States, published a book that brought together a range of interviews with a significant number of people, all of whom worked at or were directly related to Area 51. And within that, more than 70 of those interviews relate directly to those that worked or involved with the Roswell incident in one form or another.
So why keep this base secret? And I lean into my reader and I say, here's why I think the base is secret. And this came to me from a source.
The most chilling thing associated with that recounting of those interviews is the fact that the individuals who were being questioned clearly had a story that they needed to tell, but were hugely reluctant to tell it.
No one likes to hear about this kind of, possibly this kind of ghastly goings-on in the desert, but this is what my source told me.
They all use the same formula in interviews and information, but come up with a completely different explanation. So in reality, it is a legend. I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. Is virtually impossible, but every now and again the rumour goes round, does it not, of course, that they, whoever the hell they are, or the government, which part of the government, are going to tell us everything.
There are millions and millions of people that want to go there, that want to see it. I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting. But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is a suspicion that a deal was done with Stalin, that Mengele was employed to take young children and to modify them, to disfigure them, to make them look like aliens.
In 1947, Stalin did not yet have an atomic weapon. Truman did. They were bitter rivals.
Combine that with a flying saucer aircraft development, and remember, we know that Nazi Germany were experimenting with disc-shaped aircraft of one form or another. So it's not unreasonable to assume that could have been continued under Stalin's control.
Stalin made a move, fired a warning shot over Truman's bow, so to speak, to say, you may have the atomic bomb, but I have psychological warfare.
There are theories that it could have been, for example, monkeys strapped into rockets that they were testing for the purposes of seeing how it might affect the human body when they eventually made these things safe enough to travel inside.
It's a theory and speculation. What we've got to remember about Roswell as a whole, it is now within the realms of myth and legend. And getting to the actual bottom of it is pretty much impossible. Let's start at the beginning with some debris on a rancher's field. That's where we start. It doesn't sound very, out of this world, the material he has. And in no time at all, we end up with the cosmic Watergate. So then you have to look at the story in between and how it's changed and how it's evolved. And it has become a legend. It really has.
I don't believe the government's latest cover story. I'm sure they'll come out with another cover story which is equally as unconvincing as the last one.
A gray lustrous metal that resembled aluminum. It was lighter in weight.
Well, my initial reaction is maybe most of these are hoaxes and maybe a misidentification of things, but I do know of one that was not.
I had no reason to really bring it up to anybody.
It's somewhere between a military project which is so secret that it's not even recognizable now to people who have been in the military a lifetime, or it's something more interesting than that.
Let me like my colleague Dr. Dan Forgus in Romania said. He wrote a book called Hypercivilizations. He believes we are being contacted by beings from another world. But they're not a few thousand years in advance of us. They're perhaps millions and millions of years in advance of us. And that we humans on the evolutionary scale are just too dumb to recognize it. And that there's nothing we can do about that. Now, whether he's right or wrong or not, I don't know. He gave me an analogy. He said, put a TV in an ant's nest. The ants will know it's there. They'll crawl all over it. The soldier ants may even attack it. But never in 1,000 years will they know what it is, where it came from, what it's made of, and what it's supposed to do. Maybe we are the intergalactic ants.
"75 years on, there is no doubt that something of deep significance happened in Roswell in July 1947.
There was a disc-like object that come over. In the daytime, it looked like the moon does if you see it in the daytime.
Well, the surface was the same color as the rest magazine, dull metallic gray.
These people were small, and that there were quite a number of them.
We also know that the first-hand eyewitness accounts that have been reported are the end of the line in terms of providing direct evidence of what actually occurred.
I tried to make a dent in this metal. He said, you can't bend it. You can't make a mark on it.
It is so far beyond our level of technology.
The difference between theirs and ours is that from the wrist to the first joint here, that it was probably 1.5 times longer than the top part up here.
The information we've got upon which to base our own conclusions is the information we've got. We're going to get no more, because each of the individuals has now sadly passed away.
Roswell, it just was the Big Bang, the explosion of the UFO culture. It took a long time to take off, it took 30 years to take off, but when it did, just people loved the mystery of it.
Even after all these years, it's one that is still hotly debated by skeptics and believers alike.
So what we now need to do is to assess the various probabilities of each of those storylines, to then decide for ourselves what most likely took place in July 1947.
Mac thought it was a weather balloon or some sort of an experiment, that he was glad to do the government a favor to bring them the pieces. And That's actually the attitude he had when he gathered it up and took it to town.
Mac Brazel and his story of discovering the wreckage on his ranch. We noticed that he didn't have any communication technology.
So he took some, not straight away, but he took some to another rancher that lived, in inverted commas, nearby, you know. And she said, why don't you take it into town, show the sheriff? And he did, but not straight away. He was a man of not great means, so would only drive his truck into town when he had to.
But surely in the commonplace world, if you stagger across or stumble across a wreckage site, a crash site, you would worry that there were casualties somewhere in that area. You would be sufficiently concerned.
What pieces of the conversation did you hear? What do you remember about that?
How nasty the officers at the airbase were to him.
By nasty, what did he elaborate on that?
He did to them, yes. He was held for, I believe it was 3 days or 3 nights.
There was quite a bit of wreckage just on his land. So, where is it? There's no photographs of it. They've never materialized.
Furthermore, surely, if you discover that sort of wreckage, you would pick up 1 or 2 pieces and keep them safely on one side as a point of reference, later becoming souvenirs of some sort, having some sort of evidence of this debris to show the world. But we have no such thing.
I don't think that he himself went in there and did a lot of pseudo-scientific experiments with this material.
But they literally threw him in jail.
What it could have been, I wouldn't know. I still don't know.
Jesse Marcel was then dispatched to investigate and report back to the airbase. Never forget, this is Major Jesse Marcel. He was the intelligence officer at the local airbase.
And he was the gentleman who led the team that cleaned up the crash. And he's on record as having said he found an I-beam with hieroglyphics written on it.
It was not anything from this earth that I'm quite sure of. Because I was, being an intelligence officer, I was familiar with just about all materials used in aircraft and our air travel. This is nothing like that. It could not be. It could not have been.
He also took some of this wreckage home to his wife and his son. He let his son play with it and have a look at it because it was just so strange.
Looked like it was weightless. You couldn't feel that you had everything in your hands.
It just depends on your nature, doesn't it? You know, some people would be absolute, down the line, I'm an intelligence officer. But at that point, he hadn't been told not to show it to anyone.
And he was a radio amateur, loved ham radio. And I don't know the exact scenario, but I can picture that maybe they were talking on ham radios. He was talking on ham radio with somebody. And maybe the discussion came up about a recent UFO sighting. And he would say, oh, by the way, I was involved with one.
It is inconceivable in my mind that an individual of that authority stumbling across what was clearly a crash site of some sort would take 2 days as an intelligence officer to report back.
But the thing about that got me is that you couldn't even bend it, you couldn't dent it. Even with a sledgehammer would bounce off it.
So he wasn't breaking any orders. He was using his own initiative. He may just be, excited by it and wanted to share it with his family. To me, that's a natural thing to do. But like you said, as an intelligence officer, perhaps not the correct thing to do militarily. But nonetheless, that's what he did.
Surely there'd be some sort of discipline involved with that. There would have been some sort of repercussions for the delay, given the significance and the top secret nature of the discovery that had been made.
He told me not to say anything. He says, I'll handle it from now on. And that's exactly what he did. When he came out, he said, he told the press that was there, he said, that was nothing but a weather balloon, crashed weather balloon.
It's difficult to see what people would have to gain from making up such outlandish stories. For most people, they don't want the attention of being somebody who, makes things up. It's something that you wouldn't say unless it was true.
Marcel Jr., his son, went on the record many, many times, never changed his story, and he said, Philip, my involvement in it lasted for 15 minutes. That was it, when my father spread that material out on the kitchen floor.
Yeah, we felt it was all a very unique experience, and we just happened to be at the right place at the right time to see things. Actually, my own personal thoughts was, after we started sending satellites around, the Russians in 1957 with the Sputnik, I felt that maybe this was a probe that happened to land on our planet from someplace else.
From another planet.
From another origin.
Was he reprimanded in any way? Because this is what his boss is saying. This idiot's told us it's a flying saucer, but when we've looked at it, it's really just a weather balloon. Was he reprimanded? Was he sent to Siberia? I don't know what the American equivalent of that is. He said, no, he was actually promoted and he ended up working at the Pentagon. So that kind of speaks volumes, I think, in a way.
In the 1970s and then through the 1980s, there was a resurgence of interest in the Roswell incidents. A significant amount of research was being undertaken into the activities in Area 51, and that information was hitting the public domain. In 1989, an anonymous eyewitness account was provided by an individual operating under what was clearly a pseudonym of Dennis, and started telling stories about his experience on Area 51.
Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs, that are out there of extraterrestrial origin.
It's not until later that he exposed himself as being the now infamous Bob Lazar.
I was told they could have walked me in the front door, but they purposely wanted to walk me by it. I was told not to say anything and just keep my eyes forward and walk past the disc into the office area. And it's real and it's there. And I had an extremely small part in it, but I'm convinced that what I saw is absolute proof of that. There is no way we could have created those systems. There's no way we could have made the discs, the power supplies, anything to go with them.
Bob Lazar cites that he was educated at MIT and then went to work at Area 51, but it's curious that MIT themselves have no record of a Bob Lazar ever having studied there. And the US government have no records of anyone under the name Bob Lazar working in Area 51. In 1990, while he was achieving near-celebrity status with his stories of UFOs and spacecraft at Area 51, he was actually given a police conviction. And then again in 2006, he had a second police conviction. All in all, we need to be really careful about the significance of what Bob Lazar has been saying. The eyewitness account by Glenn Dennis itself is presented in a very compelling way, but we need to look at it really carefully because it's a mix of both first-hand and second-hand stories. The fragments of the story that he tells tend to be presented in such a way that we're invited to join the dots and make some very substantial conclusions.
I received a telephone call from the mortuary officer inquiring about what would be the smallest possible casket that we could get that would be hermetically sealed.
It's only because of his second-hand conversation with an ex-colleague, a nurse, who we never otherwise hear from, that then suggests that they might have been for aliens and therefore the disposal of their dead bodies, presumably.
And he said, I need to ask you some more questions. He said, in case something like this should happen, he said, we need to know what the preparation, what your preparations are for the bodies that had been laying out in the elements,
She drew him a picture of the creature on a napkin. And she said she'd seen this herself, that was stored at the base.
And yet he saw no aliens himself. We're led to conclude that that was the case, but it's based on the conversation with an ex-colleague, a nurse, who told him stories and drew pictures. And yet we never hear of that nurse again. We have no first-hand evidence supplied by that individual.
She gave me a little diagram that she had drawn some figures of some arms and face and so on. She told me that this is what, was what was in those, that it was a crash.
We're talking about 2 years after the end of the Second World War, a very different era. So people were used to keeping secrets.
We're then also told that he spotted in the back of some sort of vehicle debris that is supposedly then associated with a spacecraft. But again, there's no concrete evidence that that is the case.
There was another officer said, hey, wait a minute. And I said, looks like you had a crash. He said, I see there's some, you know, in the ambulances out there, I see a lot of wreckage. And I said, where was the crash? And he said, there wasn't any crash. He said, wait a minute. And I, you know, stood there for a minute. And he turned around, and evidently he must have waited for somebody else to come out, because there was another officer coming out. He said, this man says there was a crash out at the base. He said he wanted to know about, he was inquiring about our crash.
The plain facts that we have from the Glenn Dennis account are that, number one, he was invited on the base to produce some small hermetically sealed caskets. And then two, that he spotted in the back of a vehicle a range of metallic debris. We need to remember that Roswell Army Air Force Base itself was a center for black ops for nuclear developments of one form or another. And it will have generated a range of nuclear materials, undoubtedly radioactive in nature. Those hermetically sealed units might simply have been for the disposal of nuclear waste that the Army Air Force was concerned about.
Was there only one ship, or were they there by themselves as a scout ship? Were there any others in the Armada?
They claimed that there were 8.
The story that Shirley Wright relays of the telepathic conversation with the aliens, explaining that they were part of a fleet of spacecraft that were on an interplanetary mission to find planets that they could colonize.
I don't know whether it was a time warp or what, but they kind of got lost with their directions with where the others were going.
One of those spacecraft got disconnected from the rest and got lost and crash landed in the States.
They say where they were from or what star system they were from? And did they say they were from this galaxy?
Oh no, they indicated they were absolutely not from our galaxy.
They also said that a second one, and there were 8 of these vessels within the fleet, another one also crash landed, and this time in Siberia.
On one ship he claimed that he crashed into the Siberia.
At one point the alien beings say that they had another craft that came down over Siberia. Would they have, if they were intergalactic aliens, they don't come even from our galaxy, would they have a reference point on our planet that would allow them to know which point on the planet they crashed?
This shows a remarkable knowledge on behalf of the aliens as to various crash sites on a global basis on our planet, given the intergalactic distances that they traveled. Whilst they might not have specified Siberia telepathically, even to indicate it on a map of the world would be an extraordinary feat of capability.
Of course, they were very quick to let us know that we didn't know anything.
One of the things the aliens asked was how we explore the air and the oceans, and possibly how deeply we penetrated the oceans. This seems a really strange thing for an intergalactic species to be asking. So this was about the time, we'd only just started air travel at this time. We hadn't long started exploring the oceans in submarines. And so it's strange that there's this story that comes out of apparently alien beings who are very cagey about where exactly they come from, but it's definitely not here. But the first thing they're asking us about is, how far into the oceans can you see?
Mom's about what it was. He said the vehicle from outer space, any question. The beings on there were nothing like, not exactly like human beings. Similar, but not exactly. Being about 3.5 to 4 feet tall, very slim in stature. Their heads were hairless, with no eyebrows, no eyelashes, no hair, and sort of a pear-shaped head with the top of the head being smaller, or larger, I mean.
We need to look very closely at the detail of the substance of the Shirley Wright account. She talks fairly breezily of communication via telepathy, which in itself is extraordinary, but on top of that, of course, there's a multilingual dimension that's introduced as well, in that the aliens must be communicating in a number of different languages to a number of different individuals, which is even further on the mind-boggling scale.
I was overwhelmed. I mean, how odd. Just the thought of it, just very strange. Like, was it real or fantasy?
It's interesting that over the years more and more has come out about Roswell, and it's never been something that dilutes the story. It's always been something more interesting. Even when the government came out with their admission that the weather balloon was a cover-up.
We need to closely scrutinise the US Air Force report that was issued in 1994, their account of the Roswell incident, pulling together all the various elements of eyewitness accounts and providing a rational storyline for them. The major gist of the report is that the various eyewitness accounts can be explained away under the cover of what is referred to as Project Mogul. And Project Mogul was simply the code name given by the Army Air Force for a covert development program.
The United States Air Force were using balloons with equipment attached to it to launch it into the upper atmosphere to test to see if the Soviets were doing nuclear tests themselves. The balloons were just balloons. The equipment wasn't that great, but it was the purpose of the mission, if you like, was secret. So that's the official explanation. The vast majority of UFO researchers believe it was an ET vehicle of some description that crashed out in the desert. Some people think it's an experimental vehicle that was man-made. And I tend to lean towards the latter of that. Perhaps the reason that there's been a continual cover-up at Roswell is because it was something that we, mankind, did, that at the time possibly broke, a lot of conventions, the Geneva Convention, human rights, whatever. Hence, a reason for keeping it under wraps all these decades later.
Curiously, that report makes reference itself to the recovery of bodies from the crash site, but it explains it away in terms of crash test dummies that were being used as part of the experimentation to actually see what the impact of nuclear developments, nuclear explosions might be on models of human bodies. Therefore, if there was some sort of crash site and some sort of wreckage generated, we might not be surprised that what look like bodies will be part of that wreckage.
It makes more sense to me than it being, we all want it to be an alien spaceship, don't get me wrong, it's the most romantic idea, and but that's where I look.
Key to this explanation is that the high-altitude listening devices will have used technology undoubtedly similar to high-altitude weather balloons. So the explanation that was being provided by the Army Air Force for the debris that was found strewn across New Mexico in the vicinity of Roswell as being simply a crashed weather balloon is probably not too far from the truth.
Since 1947, we have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports that have come to us from all kinds of sources. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them, explain them to our own satisfaction. We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations.
This is the most important film in mankind's history, in the history of mankind.
And it became a sensation overnight once it was released in August. It went out on television the next day, and I thought, right, I'll sit back now. It's on TV around the world. Surely somebody will step forward and say, that's me, I'm one of the actors, or it's my studio, or no, my grandfather told me about this. I think that's my granddad, or well, you know, whatever. No witness stepped forward, said that's me. Nothing.
How do we know what is being cut up is not human? Well, it's certainly not human by the organs and the visual items within the body.
So first and foremost, you look at, is there anything on that video that's not from that era? All seem pretty accurate from what we could tell.
We also know, I mean, there has been discussed that it may be a deformed human. Maybe it suffered some kind of trauma radiation. Maybe it's had a number of different defects and abnormalities. But that all dispels as soon as you cut it open.
What about the medical procedure? Is that correct? So we sent the film to a number of pathologists, morticians, I mean, you name it. A lot of them said it looks okay to me.
There are other items within the room which then counterbalance all the things that we've spoken about.
How would you know that it's not real then, that it's fake?
Oh, because I made it.
The film was proven to be a hoax, and this was admitted by the film's makers, and they've even explained how they did it so well.
My life is divided into two sections. One side is a filmmaker, and the other side is a magician. And what turned me on into making this film was the magician, then marrying up the filmmaker. And my motivation was to create the greatest illusion perpetrated on man by a magician.
What Spiros said was, it wasn't made to con anyone, but the idea was we'd make it, we'd broadcast it, and then 6-9 months later we'd do a reveal. Ta-da! Look how clever we are. But that never happened.
And I wanted to do it on a global level. This is pre-internet, so this film, I lay claim to the first fake news. I lay claim to the first viral video, all before the internet. And that was my motivation, not to hoax anyone, not to lie about it, not once have I ever told anyone this is a real film, not once.
And it wasn't up until the Ant and Dec film was in the planning stages, they actually approached Spiros to be part of it. And he said, no, enough's enough, you know. It's time we told the truth about this.
I can show you the reasons it's not real, just like I told you all the things that were real. I made it in Camden, in London, in a house that was being renovated. It belonged to my girlfriend. And I built the set. In fact, I built 2 sets in the same room, which was for the debris footage and for the alien autopsy. There are a lot of things in the film that only I would know. For example, that the autopsy table is the only one in the world ever. You won't find it again anywhere else. Because if you did find another version, another example of this autopsy table anywhere else in the world, then I must be lying.
The problem is they did it so well that some viewers don't believe that it was actually a hoax.
We didn't just film the one film, there was 2 films. The first film was technically incorrect. Only thing now is that we were running out of time. The film was promised to the world, so we had to create it again in super fast speed, but we still had to make a body. You pour liquid latex into the mold and you swish it around so every surface is covered in latex so it creates a skin. Then you inject an expandable foam. As soon as a hardener hits it, it bubbles and blows up. In this instance, on the right leg, we had an air bubble trapped at the knee. And we didn't know, we can't see it until it comes out. But time is of the essence, we have no more time. When it came out of the mold, the knee had collapsed. We didn't have time to make another one. So I sent John, who was a sculptor who made the body, I sent John Humphreys to the butcher and I said, get me a knuckle joint, doesn't matter what it is, just the bone. And I hollowed out the knee and put a knuckle joint in and pretended it was a bullet wound from behind. So many people say they saw the alien autopsy before it was made, but they never reported it until after it was made. And I think that's pretty much speaks for itself.
The Charles Forgus interview is littered with inconsistencies, potentially merging a whole range of historic facts in one form or another.
Him and his boss, the sheriff, were en route to Roswell. They'd been looking for a guy who'd been cashing dud checks, and they managed to find the location. He talks about seeing the bodies, the recovery of the crashed UFO.
There was soldiers there by the, God, I don't know how many there, but there must have been 300 or 400 of them. They wouldn't let you get any close to them, and they're keeping the people away. People come out there and check this thing, and they wouldn't let them get close to it.
I think there is no doubt that Charles Forgus witnessed some sort of crash site. He goes into reasonable detail explaining what he saw, and clearly he and his boss, the sheriff, stumbled across something.
And across the middle of it, he measured it across the middle, it's about 100 feet.
He saw the UFO. He said it had impacted into what they call the arroyo, you know, into the rocks, and there was a crane there lifting these things out.
It banged into the wall in that creek. It hit the wall. I think it killed everyone on that thing.
It's not what he told us, it's when he found out about it is more important.
If you go back in time to the point of Roswell, it considerably predates the point at which Charles Forgus was appointed as the deputy sheriff, which didn't take place until 1953. Given a Roswell incident in 1947, we have an inconsistency.
In the 1950s, there were no books about Roswell, there were no articles about it, no television stories. You couldn't find any info. It was dead, it was gone. It never made it into the public domain in any way, never made its way into popular culture at that time.
And the sheriff himself, during the 1940s, was not the sheriff in the neighbouring county to Roswell. He had previously been in the 1930s and was re-elected in the 1950s, but not in the 1940s. So we've clearly got some inconsistencies here.
You said you saw the bodies?
Yeah.
How many did you see? Just part of the ground? So you were on your way from Big Spring into Roswell to pick a prisoner up?
The interviewers themselves were using badly structured questioning techniques that were both confusing but also leading of Charles Forgus himself, who was clearly confused. So in short, I think with Charles Forgus, we've got to him too late, effectively. The evidence that was provided was not when he was capable of recollecting to full effect precisely what happened. We've got a merging of events. There's no doubt he will have come across the publicity associated with the Roswell event, and then in later years when he stumbled across some sort of crash site, it feels like he probably merged those stories into one.
Go back to 1947. It's like I say, it's hard to go back in time. But Truman was the president, and the Cold War was really starting to hot up.
The Russian option. For this to be viable, there must have been the presence of some sort of fanatical, despotic leader in place. Well, I think we can accept that might well have been in place in the form of Stalin.
It was that the West worrying about an atomic war? There were no aliens. We're just worrying about, you know, the threat of a war between the US, or I would say the West, but certainly the US and the Soviet authorities.
So this flying disc, according to the engineer from EG&G, was something that had crashed in New Mexico, and the intent was for it to be a hoax.
To take a flying saucer styled aircraft on a prototype basis, but get it to a position where it could actually fly from Russia across to the States, or that they could smuggle some sort of prototype mock-up.
A program called Operation Paperclip was put into effect after the war, where America pillaged Third Reich scientists to head up our aerospace programs and much of our military programs. Werner von Braun is the best example.
Let us imagine for a moment that the many problems have been solved, and that after completing our space station, we are ready to begin our first voyage around the moon.
Furthermore, we need the complicity of Joseph Mengele, potentially, to do the development of the human forms to convert them into alien-type creatures.
You may have the atomic bomb, but I have psychological warfare. And a la the War of the Worlds, he wanted to send this flying disc to land in New Mexico and have people come out that looked like aliens. And the EG&G engineer told me that the child-sized pilots inside were the result of ghastly human experiments in the Soviet Union.
It's a theory and speculation. What we've got to remember about Roswell as a whole, it is now within the realms of myth and legend. And getting to the actual bottom of it is pretty much impossible. It's easy to keep blaming the Russians. I think we give them far more credit than they deserve. You know, we realized from the space race, for example, that the Soviets said we're capable of doing X, Y, and Z, but in reality they weren't. That's why the Americans got to the moon first, because they weren't as advanced as they were claiming to be, technology-wise. And that's exactly the same at the end of the Second World War. They were way behind schedule, they really were. It took them a long while to catch up with the Americans, if they ever did.
This particular storyline is really quite extraordinary. Possible, but really quite extraordinary, and you have to look a little bit further into it to understand how credible it might be. Let us not forget that Roswell took place in July 1947, just 2 years after the completion of World War II and the nuclear devastation that brought that to a close. Russia will have been at its knees coming out of the war. The chances of them getting hold of the engineering capability, both mechanical and biological, in order to deliver aliens in a spacecraft into Roswell is quite unlikely. That's a 2-year development program. There is no way they're going to be able to develop a whole new craft as a priority for them over that short period of time to counter that nuclear capability, which they didn't know about until the very end of World War II.
If this had been the crash of a spaceship from wherever, I think that the opportunities for the Americans would have been enormous so far as propaganda was concerned. Here we have first contact. Sadly, it went wrong. It's been a crash. But nonetheless, they came to America and not to the Soviet Union. They came to America. And wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You know, not only have we got our nukes, you never guess what these guys brought with them. So you better behave yourself.
So many theories about what Roswell was. It was located quite close to the area where they carried out the first nuclear tests and where they had all sorts of research and development going on for the V-2 rockets and other weapons systems. So there are theories involving secret projects, secret government projects, which perhaps we haven't even found out about to this day.
As a military operation, of course it's secret. And doesn't matter what it is, it's secret.
Following up Annie Jacobsen's research into Area 51, there were individuals she interviewed that were bursting with a desire to share secrets that they had, but terrified of the consequences of doing so.
Hence, a reason for keeping it under wraps all these decades later. Fear of embarrassment and the propaganda that would go with that. We do know, for example, not just our own government, but especially the Americans, have experimented on their own troops at times and done all kinds of weird and wonderful things. The CIA perhaps had a free hand to do whatever it liked at one point. So it wouldn't surprise me.
They knew that what they had witnessed, the knowledge they had within them, was incendiary on a national scale, if not an international scale. We know that presidents have found it remarkably difficult to pick apart the UFO story in the United States.
Living in this nuclear age makes it imperative that we do talk. Our commitment to dialogue is firm and unshakable, but we insist that our negotiations deal with real problems, not atmospherics.
If the President of the United States was aware of this type of experimentation, they would become instantly culpable of crimes against humanity.
It's somewhere between a military project which is so secret that it's not even recognizable now to people who have been in the military a lifetime, or it's something more interesting than that.
I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting. But Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
So the idea of treating this as the ultimate top secret surely has some credibility and starts to explain some of the reactions that we see.
Looked like it was weightless. You couldn't feel that you had anything in your hands.
More like it was, the metal looked more like stainless steel that had been heated. It was blue.
At that time, let's say it wasn't important. We wanted to see the stuff we heard about. And of course, by that time, it was all picked up.
Well, I hope it's been worth something. I think the American people ought to know what's going on.
He said that he saw a UFO fall.
In my first impression was, this is Egyptian hieroglyphics, but I knew enough at that time to know that it wasn't, because hieroglyphics usually have some animal symbols in it also. If there was.
All I remember seeing, they said that saucer crashed out there in the canyon.
For me, the most rational explanation of the Roswell incident is that it was merely a US Black Ops development program gone wrong. In July 1947, probably under Project Mogul, there were high-altitude listening devices being used and there was nuclear experimentation.
It could be that we were visited by humanoid beings from another place, whether somewhere else on the globe or from another planet altogether. I'm not sure.
I mean, we all want it to be an alien spaceship, don't get me wrong, it's the most romantic idea.
Let us not forget this was a nuclear development site, and as the technology emerged, undoubtedly as a US government they would want to experiment beyond purely the mechanics of a nuclear explosion to understand what the impact would be on the human form. And therefore not unreasonable to assume they would start using human beings of one form or another to actually gauge what the impact of nuclear fallout might be.
I'd never heard of Roswell before I got involved, and I'm not a ufologist, I'm not even a UFO fanatic. Everybody who was there saw something. Now what that thing was is then left to our imagination, because it was hushed up very quickly.
It then works in their favour for stories of UFOs to surround the whole Roswell incident as potentially a plausible explanation, because it diverts the researchers away from really digging into what is the most likely outcome, that we have a US development program that's gone wrong, that has been clumsily covered up, and then used UFOs as a neat way of diverting attention.
Nonetheless, it is a fascinating subject. There is a UFO phenomena, plural, not phenomenon singular, out there that deserves to be studied. And as a UFO researcher, that's the way I look at my role, is to document this information in the hope that at some point somebody will be able to make sense of it all.